Nigeria is a country famous for its film industry. I know, by now you know that India and the United States are the two countries that produce the most movies in the world. Well, Nigeria could very well be in third place. In 2022 alone, they produced over 2,500 movies. In fact, just when we talk about Hollywood or Bollywood, we could also talk about Nollywood. And I know what you're thinking. Nigerian cinema? I didn't even know that existed. And to be honest, it's not surprising. We're talking about very low budget films which are only consumed in Africa. But this is a good example of all the potential this country has and how little we know about it. Nigeria is not just another African country. It is the country with the largest economy in Africa. We're talking about a full-fledged oil power with the potential to become a new Russia. However, I'm sure that when you think of Nigeria, the first image that comes to mind is this one. That's right, it's also the country of Boko Haram, the country where they went as far as kidnapping 276 girls in 2014. Well, Visual Politic viewers, the sad reality is that for all the potential Nigeria has, today, it's a miserable country. No matter how much income oil generates, 40% of the population lives in absolute poverty. We're talking about more than 80 million people. Because yes, Nigeria is the 7th most populous country in the world. They have more than 206 million inhabitants. But that's not all. Pay attention to this graph. Here you can see the enormous potential of this country. It is the 9th country in the world in terms of income from crude oil exports. And in the ranking of countries with the most reserves, it ranks 11th, just behind the United States. So here comes Nigeria's big opportunity. The European Union needs new oil suppliers, and Nigeria could be one of the most significant. What's more, this country has a constitution and a state structure that is, theoretically, democratic, something that is not at all common in Africa. What it does have in common with other neighboring countries, however, is corruption, low voter turnout, limited civil liberties, and weak institutions that cause Nigerian democracy to be considered very weak. But despite all this, the question is, could oil and an improvement of their democracy really lift Nigerians out of poverty? Could Nigeria save Europe with its dinosaur juice? Could it even become a kind of African Russia without the problems of the original Russia, of course? Today, we're going to answer all of these questions. But first, let's look at a bit of history.
One country, 250 ethnic groups.
Nigeria is a country you've probably heard of before. After all, it is the 7th most populous country in the world and one of the most oil rich. But what exactly is Nigeria? You see, Nigeria is inhabited by approximately 250 different ethnic groups, each with its own traditions and languages. The Hausas, the Igbos, the Yorubas, and hundreds more are distributed throughout this territory. Well, when the British arrived here and established a colonial regime in the middle of the 19th century, the differences between the majority ethnic groups did not take long to become apparent. In fact, the British divided the colony into 3 regions. The north of the Hausa and the Muslim Fulani, the Igbo east, and the Yoruba west, who were mainly Christian. And do you think they treated all 3 equally? Well, not at all. The golden child of the empire in the colony was the Muslim north, where the emirs helped the British forces in exchange for luxuries. Anyway, it was the usual colonial story. Basically, in the end, the British opted to grant independence to Nigeria in 1960, but not because they were tired of them, but because they were already activist groups pushing too hard. For example, the Action Group and the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroonians. However, you can imagine that a country composed of 250 ethnic groups is going to have problems. They're hardly going to end up understanding each other politically. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. And it didn't take long for it to happen either. 6 years after independence, the first coup d'etat took place. Since then, Nigeria has been plunged into chaos, up to 6 coup d'etats between 1966 and 1999, and constant tension between the Islamic North and the Christian South. But there were not only coup d'etats, they also had a civil war. In 1967, in present-day Tongo, they reported the killing of citizens from the northern region of Nigeria in the eastern region. The citizens of the north became so furious that they started attacking and massacring the Igbos in the north. Not surprisingly, many of these Igbos returned to their region of origin, the east. In the same year, Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu declared the independence of the region, making it the Republic of Biafra. Well, at first, it seemed that Biafra would succeed. After all, it was Nigeria's most oil-rich region. But its dream of independence eventually turned into a nightmare. They ended up totally surrounded and isolated, resulting in a famine that killed more than 3,000 people a day in Biafra, including 1,000 children. And remember, we're talking about every single day.
Starvation is a weapon of war, and we have every intention of using it against the rebels. Alison Aida, head of Nigerian delegation, Niamey Peace Talks, July 1968.
In the end, Biafra surrendered and became part of Nigeria again. But as you can imagine, the Igbos were never going to forget this conflict. However, despite all this, in 1999, the situation slowly began to change. After the death of the dictator Abacha, the so-called Fourth Republic began in Nigeria. After several failed constitutions and republics completely dominated by the army, the Fourth Republic seemed to bring in new hope. In the same year, new elections were held, and the son of the ex-dictator Obasanjo won. And since then, in successive elections, only Obasanjo's chosen ones have won, all from the People's Democratic Party, the main conservative and economically liberal party in the country. However, always amidst accusations of electoral fraud and political violence. Nevertheless, in 2015, Nigerians finally decided to put their foot down.
Nigeria election. Muhammadu Buhari wins presidency.
Exactly, VisualPolitik viewers. In 2015, the Nigerian people swung left and elected the opposition party's leader, Social Democrat Muhammadu Buhari. So, why was this good news? No, it is not because we like this politician or anything like that. In this case, it's good news that, for the first time in history, Nigeria had a peaceful transition of power. In other words, it looked like democracy may actually be working for the first time in this country. So the question is this really a trend that is going to develop? Well, let's find out.
The Russia of Africa.
Over the years, Nigeria has become the leading dinosaur juice exporting country in Africa. In fact, between 2015 and 2019, it was producing more than 2 million barrels of crude oil per day. To give you an idea, Angola, which is its main competitor in Africa, only exported 1.4 million barrels per day in 2019. So we could be talking about a veritable African Russia. Nigeria has maintained its exports based on dinosaur juice since 1977, when it created its state-owned company. But the reality is that Nigerian oil began to be exploited much earlier. In 1937, when Nigeria was still a British colony, the British oil companies Shell and BP began exploring the territory for oil. In 1953, they found small quantities that they could not yet trade. However, in 1956, they found their first commercially viable black gold mine. It was in the city of Oliburi in the Nigeria Delta, the most oil-rich area of the country. These companies knew their investments were fully secured, so they decided to start refining the crude they were extracting. In 1965, they built the first refinery, and from then on, more companies arrived, Chevron and Texaco from the US, along with the Italian Egypt. And I know what you're thinking. What a lucky strike for the oil companies, right? No doubt about it. We are used to seeing energy resources firmly in the hands of the state, of the exporting country. These are the models of Russia and Saudi Arabia, for example. But in Nigeria, things are much more flexible. Yes, it is true, the current constitution gives the Nigerian state full control over its natural and energy resources. But the reality is that they have never been afraid to sell more exploitation rights for juicy paychecks. So it is no wonder that Nigeria has 159 oil fields and 1,500 extraction wells. And of course, many of them do not belong to the state. Most of them belong to foreign companies. In fact, according to the Nigerian Oil Investment Manager, 98% of the sector's oil reserves and operating assets are in the hands of 6 Western private oil companies, the most important of which is Shell. And not only that, between Shell, Exxon, Chevron, Egypt, and Texaco, they own up to 6 oil export terminals as well as several pipelines. But make no mistake about it, the Nigerian government is no fool. Nigeria has not allowed foreign companies to control the entire production chain. The refineries belong to the state. Remember that refinery that Shell and BP started building in 1965? The state bought it in 1978, and almost all the big refineries are state-owned. The fact that oil has undoubtedly become the country's biggest export, it accounts for more than 70% of all foreign sales. Now, what does this all mean though? Well, if you've been following VisualPolitik for a long time, you can already imagine corruption. Nigeria is plagued with problems around the oil sector. It will come as no surprise if I tell you that one of the biggest scourges in Nigeria is corruption. And not just any corruption, but corruption specifically in the oil sector. And if the impact of corruption in Nigeria were not so great, we wouldn't even be telling you about it. But the fact is, more than 20% of the country's GDP goes down the drain precisely for this reason. Just to give you an idea, the country's entire public debt could be paid off with what it loses due to corruption. The problem is that both politicians and businessmen have benefited from corruption in the sector. For example, Nigeria's former oil minister, Diezani Alison Madueke, was convicted of allowing no less than $20 billion to disappear from the Nigerian National Oil Company. Even the richest person in the country and in Africa, Aliko Dangote, a businessman, has been accused of buying favors from former President Obasanjo in 2003. Corruption has meant that Nigerian citizens do not often see a single dollar from the sale of their country's crude oil. In fact, according to the World Bank, only 1% of Nigeria's entire population has benefited from the oil sector. This is not only bad news for Nigerians, it is also bad news for the oil companies themselves. In many parts of Nigeria, people are beginning to vandalize wells and steal crude oil and fuels from the already dilapidated refineries and pipelines. Therefore, we're not surprised to come across news stories like this one.
Nigeria's illegal oil refineries. Dirty, dangerous, lucrative.
In many towns and villages, such as those in the Niger Delta, citizens are stealing crude oil and vandalizing oil installations, which makes sense. For many of them, this is the only way to get by in a country with an unemployment rate of 33%, which rises to 54% for young people. Corruption has therefore led many communities throughout the south of the country to steal crude oil and refine it themselves. But that's not the only problem. Check this out.
Failed state?
Do you remember Biafra, the territory that tried to gain independence from Nigeria in 1967? Well, when we told you earlier that the Igbos had not forgotten what happened during the Civil War, we meant that many of them are still around today. In fact, the Igbo secessionists have their own militant group, a group that is now blacklisted as a terrorist group in Nigeria. Do you know why? Because the Nigerian government also accuses them of stealing crude oil and sabotaging refineries. Whatever the case, the one thing is certain: the oil thefts in the country have caused the Nigerian state to lose millions of dollars. To give you an idea, some estimates indicate that since 2008, losses due to theft, sabotage, and the resulting drop in production may reach $100 billion. So it is logical that the country's leaders and international investors are worried. But it is not the only terrorist group in the country. In fact, it is far from it, and it's not even the most bloodthirsty by far. To tell the truth, the most feared of all has been one that many of you, I'm sure, will know: Boko Haram. Boko Haram was started in 1995 as a non-violent Muslim youth group. However, over the years, considering that Nigeria's drift was totally contrary to the wishes of, Allah, they began their crusade to turn the country into an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. And in order to achieve this, in 2002, they began to adopt violent methods. Its first target was the city of Maiduguri, and its expansion began throughout the rest of the country, especially in the northeast of Nigeria. However, it was not until 2009 that it began to gain the strength that has made them the most feared terrorist group in the country, and one of the most bloodthirsty in the entire Sahel region. Their narrative appeals to the most disadvantaged sectors of the country. This is how they have come to recruit more than 40,000 fighters. But hold on a minute, because Boko Haram is not the only terrorist group plaguing Nigeria. Take a look at this map. In addition to the problems with Boko Haram and the secessionist movement for Biafra, the Nigerian government has other open fronts, from the gangs in the northwest of the country to Yoruba secessionism in the south, such as that of Biafra, or the conflict between Muslim herdsmen and Christian farmers that runs throughout the whole country. So is Nigeria a failed state? Most analysts have no doubt it is. The Nigerian government is not in control of each area dominated by Boko Haram, nor can it intervene in the conflict between herders and farmers. In this case, we are talking about a conflict that has killed more than 20,000 people since 1999. However, there are others who are not so fixated on the state's control over its entire sovereign territory. That is why we have also heard analysts who prefer to say that it is not a failed state, but a failing state, which is not the same thing. What's more, they say that Nigeria could begin to function for 3 reasons. There is greater political stability, there is greater tolerance among ethnic groups, and there is a stronger Nigerian identity. But the reality is that, as of today, the Nigerian government cannot control all of its territory. So, it's a failed state. However, things can change. The war in Ukraine has provided a window of opportunity for this country. But what is happening in Ukraine have to do with Nigeria? Well, pay attention to this news item.
Russia to ban oil sales under price cap, Kremlin says. Moscow ready to reduce output to compensate for lost exports, says Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak.
Russia has already communicated that it will not give more oil to the European Union if it puts a price cap on it. This means one thing: Europe needs new suppliers of dinosaur juice. This could be Nigeria's chance to start turning things around. Also, Nigerian crude is very similar in quality to Saudi Arabian crude. That is, the best quality, easy to refine, and relatively cheap to extract. Nigeria could start making its wells work relentlessly. However, there are several problems that could threaten this dream. The main one is that their production of barrels per day depends on what OPEC Plus allows. And taking into account their recent trend, they will continue to reduce the production in order to raise the prices even more. In addition, the rampant corruption in the country will continue to make this dream impossible. With the more money that is stolen and the less that reaches the citizens, the more theft and sabotage there will be. In other words, less money. It's kind of a vicious cycle. Finally, the refineries and some pipelines are in terrible condition. Government funds go through so much bureaucracy that maintenance of oil facilities is often almost non-existent. And naturally, the worse the infrastructure, the lower the production. Nigeria has taken the first steps to solving some of these problems by achieving some democratic stability. But we will have to see what happens in next year's elections, because knowing Nigeria's history, we would not be surprised if there is another coup d'etat. But now, the questions are over to you. Will Nigeria manage to put an end to corruption and terrorism? Will it become the new Russia for the European Union? Will it manage to improve the living conditions of its citizens? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here on Visual Politic, we release new videos every single week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, so we know. All the best, and I'll see you next time.